All right, good afternoon and welcome. My name is Lori Karchner. I'm the Curator of Education here at the George Washington University Museum and the Textile Museum. And on behalf of the museum, I want to welcome all of you to this event. Thank you so much for being here. It's really fantastic to see a group like this gathered together again after it's been quite some time since we've had a real community-based conversation about sustainability in fashion. I'm just going to take a moment to introduce the museum to you in case any of you are here for the very first time. The George Washington University Museum and the Textile Museum has been open here at GW since 2015, but it had a former life. The Textile Museum used to be in a different part of the city up on S Street in the Kalorama neighborhood. But the Textile Museum is a very special kind of museum in not only the city, but in all of North America, where the Textile Museum's collection represents 5 different continents and 5 different millennia, spanning 5 millennia of human history in the textile arts. So the collection is over 20,000 works of textile arts from around the world with a focus on non-Western traditions. So we're really a special sort of place as an art museum, and very happy to be situated here on the campus of George Washington University, where we have the opportunities to work with so many students and faculty on topics around textiles and all of the interdisciplinary connections that they have. I'll also mention that here in this facility, there is also a study collection, the Coats and Textile Traces study collection, which adds another about 4,000 works of textile arts that are just small or fragments. And that is accessible right here in this building on the lower level by appointment for researchers and classes to conduct research of whatever topics they're interested in. And we also have in this building on the 4th floor a library for textile research, and it also contains about 20,000 volumes of books and books catalogs, journals, and other rare and hard to find resources about textile studies. So please feel free to join us. We're open Tuesday through Saturday for visitors, and we encourage you to use the museum for your own research into fashion and textiles throughout your careers. So the intersection of sustainability in fashion and sustainability in textiles has been swirling around this museum for a long time, especially since we arrived here at the campus of George Washington University. And students and faculty are talking about it. They're creating classes and workshops, social events, and the challenge really was trying to bring people together. So having the museum here as an anchor has been a real benefit. And in 2018, something sort of special happened, that the DC Sustainable Fashion Collective hosted their conference here. And that was a real sort of kicking off point of gathering a lot of the community together on this topic. In 2019, we had a second successful event with the Fashion Collective. And then, of course, there was a setback after 2020. But now we're very excited to be rekindling some of this momentum with the campus and with the community. And this event really does kind of bring some of those elements together in a really nice way. So before we begin, I'll just thank a few of the partners who made this event possible. First, to Remake, the global advocacy organization fighting for fair pay and climate justice in the clothing industry. Remake is a team of over 1,000 global ambassadors who work to end the poverty, wages, unsafe conditions, and gender-based violence with which our clothes are made today. Also, thank you to Climate Classes, a growing DC-based community that is focused on civic education and community building in the climate change space. Climate Classes is thrilled to have this opportunity to work with these organizations, and we're thrilled to have you here. And to the GW Sustainable Fashion Student Organization. It's a new student collective hosted here at the museum, made up of George Washington University students, faculty, and staff who aim to spread more sustainable fashion practices through campus and through the DC community. So thank you to all of the people who have helped organize this event, to my colleague Katrina Orsini for making it possible for it to happen at the museum, and to all those who have participated in the fair. After this panel's over, make sure you go visit the tables around the museum for the fair. So to start our event, I'll just introduce our panel moderator very briefly. Laurel Anderson Hoffner is an advocate for improving the rights of women, men, and children who work in the global supply chains. Laurel has experience working on these issues with the UN, as well as the US Department of Labor, and she volunteers as a Remake ambassador. So Lauren, I'll turn it to you to introduce our panelists and begin the conversation.
Perfect. Thank you for that. And hello, everybody. Thanks for being out here with us today. We're really excited about this conversation. So to get us started, I think probably most people in the room here are here because you're interested in fashion or in the garment sector, but you're probably also concerned about its environmental and social impacts. It's something that we hear some about in the news or in various articles, but something that feels like this very complex problem. So I'm very excited because today we have a huge range of diversity in the backgrounds and the skill sets of the speakers who will be here and who will be I'll be introducing in just a moment. And we're going to be highlighting these different angles. And then at the end, if we have time, we'll be opening it up for Q&A. So please save your questions. And then also I'll go down the line and introduce our speakers. And if you can hold your applause till the end, that way we can get through everybody. So first, here we have Robin Runge. Robin is a legal expert on gender-based violence and harassment in the world of work. Her career has included the successful advancement and enforcement of local, state, national, and international law and policy solutions to end gender and sex-based violence harassment as barriers to economic security. Currently, Robin is a consultant and an associate professorial lecturer in law at the GW University Law School, so here on this campus, where she's taught domestic violence law, public interest law, and in the clinical education program since 2004. She's an author of several law review articles and most recently co-author of the book, Stopping Gender-Based Violence in the World of Work. And this book describes the landmark global campaign that led to the adoption of the International Labor Organization Convention 190, the first ever binding international treaty to eliminate violence and harassment in the world of work, including gender-based violence. Robin has also worked in roles at Solidarity Center, the U.S. Department of Labor, and has served as a Fulbright Senior Research Scholar. So I know Robin will be talking a lot about Convention 190 today, and we're excited about that. Next, we have Caitlin Rooney. She is the Director of Economic Development for U.S. Senator Kirsten Gillibrand. Caitlin was born and raised in Troy, New York, and she spent the past decade working in and around politics. She's a veteran of Hillary Clinton's 2016 presidential campaign, a former communications specialist at the New York State Department of Labor, and for the past 5 years, she's served in the office of U.S. Senator Kirsten Gillibrand. In the Senate, Caitlin currently serves as the Director of Economic Development, covering a broad range of policy portfolios, including appropriations, budget, economic development, paid family leave, organized labor, and women's health and education. She's a key advisor on the Fashioning Accountability and Building Real Institutional Change Act, which we call the Fabric Act, and she'll be speaking on later today. And she spent the past year working in the garment manufacturing policy space. Next, we have Holly, and Holly Thompson is a zero waste campaign associate at the Public Interest Research Group. She currently works on campaigns to help Whole Foods reduce their plastic, as well as sustainable fashion campaigns to get companies to stop burning their overstock goods. She recently graduated from Catholic University and organized support for environmental initiatives on her campus. She was able to create a program where students received course credit for working on environmental projects on campus. And one of these projects was a thrift store, which opened up in the fall. She also enjoys sewing and upcycling clothes in her spare time. And then last but not least, we have Tara Vassefi. And Tara is a program analyst with the Donation and Reuse program at the DC Department of Energy and Environment. Before starting this role in May 2022, Tara worked as an attorney at the nexus of technology and social impact, parallel to pursuing her passion for waste eradication ventures. During the pandemic, Tara found a healing pilgrimage in the DC Mutual Aid Network, a leader-full movement of neighbors helping each other to meet their basic needs. Along with countless others, she advocated in the spirit of solidarity, not charity, and a community van named Billy. And Tara began practicing waste diversion as ritual, mostly through delivering furniture from transient neighbors to those processing the extreme trauma of homelessness and housing insecurity, food insecurity, and post-eviction. Throughout this time, Tara also led a tech working group through Mozilla Foundation called Truth as a Public Good, where hackers, data scientists, and others worked to develop an app that could streamline and systemize this kind of community-based, decentralized approach to sustainability. So as you can see, we have a great wide range of panelists here, and I hope you can join me in welcoming them for our discussion today. Great. So as I mentioned, the sector is extremely complex and it touches at so many different levels. So I'm going to ask the first question to Robin, who's going to be representing the global perspective. And so I wanted to ask you, Robin, if you could tell us a little bit about the conditions faced by women working throughout the garment sector.
Yeah, so first I just want to thank you for having me, for inviting me to be here. I actually am looking forward to learning a great deal from my colleagues and from all of you. It's a privilege and an honor. I usually am across the quad, so it's nice to be here. So I'm going to say some things that are maybe shocking but not surprising. I feel like that's the space I live in a lot when I talk about gender-based violence and harassment. It's shocking but not surprising, as particularly the women in the room, the women of color, the people who identify as women, people who, anybody, but really mostly women and people who identify as women. So I've had the privilege of doing global work with garment workers in Bangladesh, Cambodia, Indonesia, South Africa, I'm forgetting countries, Liberia, all over the world. It has been exactly that, a privilege to sit in space with the women, and they are predominantly women, though it's shifting. You know, Bangladesh is actually, right now, it's interesting. We're getting to a 50-50 point in terms of who's in the factories making our clothes. But globally, when you look at statistics, the majority of the people who are making our clothes are women, and they are working in unbelievably horrific conditions. I'm going to focus on the gender-based violence and harassment, but I have to contextualize this with the reality that these are exploitative situations driven by incredible power inequity. And so the kind of exploitation that I'm going to talk about, gender-based violence and harassment, is happening alongside, right, incredible occupational and safety health problems. We have women who are pregnant and fainting, right? We have all kinds of toxicity. No one is getting paid appropriately. There is precarity in their jobs, meaning that forget getting a contract, right? Clarity about your relationship with your employer, how long you're going to be there, any kind of security you can expect about being able to know that when you get up tomorrow morning, you're going to have a job again, forget it. And if all of those things are present, and unemployment is very high in all of the countries. The other country I've done a lot of work in is Lesotho. The unemployment rate in all of these countries is unbelievably high. And then we had COVID, okay? And so if you're living in a space where most of the people you know don't have jobs, formal or informal, and you're struggling to stay alive, you're going to experience levels of exploitation that I think many of us, and I know I certainly was not familiar with until I had the privilege of sitting with them and listening to their stories. So we know globally, more than 60% of individuals in the garment sector, and let me be very clear, I'm talking about women who are sitting at sewing machines day in, day out. If they're lucky, they have a sewing machine. And sometimes they're using the sewing, in these very dank and dark and dusty spaces. They've been wearing masks for decades so that they can breathe. And it's really hard to imagine what it looks like. But globally, and that's a dangerous thing to do because there's such vast diversity in our world, but we know globally that 60 to 70% of the women working in garment factories have described experience with the gender-based violence and harassment. That includes online harassment, emailing, right, calling. That includes physical touching, groping, name calling, rape. sexual violence, the full spectrum of behaviors. And I want to be clear, it's gender-based as well as sex-based. This is not about sexual attraction. This is all about power, y'all. And the majority of the people doing the work, as I said, are women, and the people who possess the power in their spaces are most often men. And so one of the classic scenarios that women would describe to me, actually in many different countries, was the sewing machine mechanic. The sewing machine mechanic is an extraordinarily powerful person. If you work in a garment factory, because your sewing machine needs to work so that you can make your quotas. And so in exchange for that, many of the sewing machine mechanics, the majority of whom are men, require being able to have sex with or touch inappropriately the workers, right? And they basically say, like, if you won't let me do this, then I won't fix your machine, or I'll fix your machine last, or I'll fix it poorly, right? So I have to keep coming around here, and you lose time. So that's just one like very concrete example. There have been studies done now on the country level in Bangladesh, in Indonesia, Cambodia, and Lesotho that show that in those particular countries, the rates of gender-based violence and harassment are even higher. And so I want to be really clear. This is not 10% of workers. This is not 20% of workers. It basically means that if you're working in the garment sector in the world, right, in those countries in particular, you are likely to experience on a regular basis, right, verbal, emotional, physical, mental, and sexual abuse. And we'll get in, I could talk forever about like why this continues to happen when there are laws in many of these countries that are intended to prevent this. But remember it, and I know this is the space, and you all remind me more than anybody else. Remember when you buy your clothes to look at the label and think about what transpired in order for you to be able to purchase that piece of clothing, usually at a very low cost in the United States. So I hope that wasn't too depressing.
Well, I think maybe some of us are already familiar with these dynamics and want to be a part of those solutions. And so, again, the sector is really immense. And Robin just highlighted some of the global dynamics at play. There's also garment manufacturing that occurs in the U.S. So I wanted to hand it over to Caitlin next. And Caitlin, could you tell us a little bit about the working conditions faced by garment workers in the U.S. and some of the issues that are prevalent in the domestic industry?
Yeah, absolutely. I wish I was going to give a rosier interpretation of things than Robin is, but unfortunately, we face a lot of these same issues domestically. I think one of the things that we have been really focusing on in our office and what we can kind of change is the wage portion of things. The tying of wages to how you are treated in the workforce is inextricable in this industry. We, in working with the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the Department of Labor, found that there are instances where people are getting paid as little as $2.77 an hour to make clothing in the United States. Sweatshops are still a thing in the United States. So when we look at what it means to be a garment worker here, it's a similar idea. It's predominantly a women-run industry. They're more likely than not women of color. They're oftentimes immigrant women, and that leads itself rife for that same level of exploitation, whether it's your immigration status or simply just the harassment that you experience. So really the work that our office is trying to center around is how do we use the levers that we have at the federal government and help to even that playing field, set more significant standards for the workforce here. So that way people are not necessarily having to be exposed to that on a regular basis, and also have the tools to fight back against their employers. Whether that's through organizing your workplace as well, which is a huge portion of the kind of old population of garment workers were organized labor. Some are still organized folks, especially in the garment district in New York City. We've got places like Workers United, Unite Here, who represent longstanding shops where they aren't experiencing a low piece rate pay scale that allows people to pay them, like that precipitously low wage. They've got those worker protections. And so I think that this is kind of where the United States needs to go in terms of protecting the workforce that we have here. And to be clear, it's a much smaller workforce than it's ever has been. At its peak in the 70s, this was a 1.5 million person workforce. That number is around 90,000 people today. We've seen a huge drop off. But if we're going to talk about looking at the label in your clothing and we want to push for a concept of made in America, we need to make that mean something. And starting with making sure that everyone is paid fairly and equitably and given protections at work is the first way to do it.
Thanks for that These are both, some of the social, the human impact, but there's also the climate impact and the significant amount of pollution, emissions, all of that comes with clothing production. So Holly, I wanted to ask you about the private sector and corporate component. How do you see corporations contributing to the environmental and social hazards of the fashion industry?
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest things is the lack of transparency with all of these companies and their supply chains. So I'm gonna kind of go through that. So people don't think about the life cycle of clothes. So they start with the extraction and the planting of cotton or plastic from the fossil fuels and things like that. And with that, there's a lot of water pollution from the chemical runoff from these cotton fields. And there's also droughts that because these fields use so much water, we don't think about the water impacts of that first stage. And then so we get to the factories, and they have a lot of chemical dye runoff from dyeing these fabrics. And that basically pollutes these third world countries because they don't have the same water infrastructure that we have in the United States. So there's a lot of health effects from those chemicals, from the cotton fields, and then from the factories with their dye runoff. So then you get to the transportation with the emissions and things like that. And then when you have clothes, there's a lot of clothes that have the chemical PFAS in them, which is a forever chemical, and it's used to reduce ability for clothes to catch on fire, but it can be toxic. So basically that's in your clothes, and then it makes them difficult for them to be recycled. So there's not a lot of places where you can recycle textiles. And that becomes a problem after because there's a lot of overstock that companies have. So basically they order these large amounts of clothes, and then because they want the cycle to be fast and running through and making more profit year after year, they burn a lot of their overstock. And then because we don't know a lot of numbers behind how much this is happening, it's hard to keep track of, and companies don't really put in the effort to keep track through their supply chain. So it's affecting people and their health at each stage of the life cycle.
Thank you for that. And something I think we don't always think about is how textile waste impacts us locally on our own individual levels in our own communities. And so I wanted to ask Tara to tell us a little bit about how fashion waste affects DC and the residents who live in DC.
Okay, how many of you all are residents of DC or spend a lot of your time in DC? Okay, so you probably would be, I think, a more reliable source of how it affects residents, how fashion waste affects residents. I really want to hear from you all about how it affects you. From a mathematical standpoint, I guess, the information that I have is that the Department of Public Works had a study in 2021 called the Waste Characterization Study. It's been really interesting. I just started in May, and it's been really interesting understanding how our local government works. It's fascinating. And basically, literally where you are in the district, you could have a completely different agency that's responsible for trash, responsible for law enforcement, responsible for da-da-da-da. But generally, the Department of Public Works is the agency in DC that deals with picking up trash and doing something with it. So they have this study called the Waste Characterization Study. From what I understand, it was a very large, very expensive study where they went through and actually characterized the trash that was making its way to our local, they're called transfer stations. And they found that clothing textiles make up 6% of residential trash, causing our city to spend an estimated $200,000 a year to dispose of unwanted clothing and other textiles as trash. The Department of Public Works right now is putting together a zero waste plan for the city, and I'm sure you all or many of you have heard of it. They have a really, I would say, robust engagement plan that is going on right now, and so I would encourage you all to let us know how fashion waste affects you, and you can do that through this zero waste DC plan draft framework. Go and let your thoughts be known, and let's get a real robust understanding of how fashion waste affects us beyond just the number of tonnage that ends up in the transfer stations or the landfill, because there's so much more that I think we can really glean from that kind of engagement?
Thank you. Yeah, data can be such an important piece in driving action and helping us to understand the scale and the scope of the issues facing us within the fashion industry. Now we've outlined some of the various issues, and of course there are many, many more, and I'm sure some of you in the room might work on these issues or have done your own research on other aspects of the fashion and garment sector as well. But today we're really hoping to focus on some of the solutions and what we all as a collective community might be able to do within this space. And so I wanted to ask Robin about ILO Convention 190, which we mentioned in her bio, because it was such a groundbreaking policy instrument. And she's going to tell the story. She's written a book on this. She was part of leading that fight for workers all around the world to get this policy instrument not only drafted but also adopted. So can you tell us about what the convention accomplishes and how the campaign to get it adopted around the world has succeeded?
Yeah, absolutely. And my co-authors are now in other countries doing, Robin, why didn't you bring the book? Because I'm not good at this. Anyway, but I will say this, if anybody is interested, you can tell, like, I am a nonprofit girl to my core. Anyway, in all seriousness, the book is actually about the journey that led to the adoption of the first ever global binding legal standard to address gender-based violence and harassment in the world of work. And the story it tells is of women workers who led this campaign. Mostly unionized workers, a huge percentage of whom are garment workers. So when you look at this tool and you see how it defines gender-based violence and harassment, you see how it defines work and where it's performed, you see how how the remedies are described. Please know and understand, for the first time in my life, and I've been doing this work for almost 30 years, those are the words of the workers who disproportionately experience these abuses. And it was a privilege to be in that space again in Geneva during 2 years of negotiations. It was over 10 years of a global campaign of women workers within their unions saying we cannot have decent work for all workers, let alone equity, if we don't address gender-based violence and harassment. It is that pervasive. And we all know, right? It doesn't just impact the person being targeted. Your entire workplace is infested with this when it's happening. Nobody likes to see this happen, but that doesn't make it easy to figure out what to do about it. So they worked for over a decade to convince governments, unions, and employers, because this is a tripartite structure within the UN. It's the only place where governments and employers and unions come together and negotiate these tools that they are then all beholden to. And they led this charge, and I assisted with participatory research and helping guide them and making sure that they were able to get to Geneva, and we got interpreters in every language you can imagine so that they could actively participate and talk to decision makers and help them understand why limiting protections to workers, to employees, for example, is insufficient. Because as I mentioned, most of the people doing this work are not full-time employees recognized under the law. So you would leave out all these women in the garment work factories, in many, not all of them, but in many garment factories in the world, they are not formal employees. So if you said that these protections only apply to employees, and they're like, no. They also saw from the beginning that we're not going to eradicate gender-based violence and harassment if we don't also address homophobia and racism and xenophobia, right? That they're experiencing all of these things together. Many of the garment workers are migrant workers internationally as well and have multiple identities that they bring with them to this work. And so you see that reflected in the document. So I could go on and on, but it was the story, like I said, in my book, and the story of this convention is the story of women workers coming together and demanding these protections and articulating so that there was no longer possible. The vast majority of governments, including the United States, voted in support of this. The United States has not voted in support of a UN global standard in a very long time. This was in 2019. I'm just going to leave that right where it is. Okay? And now we're in the enforcement phase, right? We're in the place of getting governments to ratify this and implement it. And that's very exciting. And I'll talk more about that and how you can get involved in that. But for me to share with you and be in this space, it'd be much better if one of my sisters was here, right? From Cambodia or from Bangladesh, and could share with you what that experience was like, because they're now continuing to fight back in their countries, in their factories, right? Using this tool that they created. And that is awesome.
Yeah, we had Kalpona Acker. She's one of the women who
Great
were very
example.
involved in this campaign from Bangladesh. She was actually here in DC for an event that Remake had back in, I think it was May. And she was such a powerful person to hear from. So if you ever have an opportunity to hear directly from workers, I would highly encourage you to be able to go to that and to make that a priority, because I think also we might be competing with some other activities out there. Sorry, Bo. Oh, tug of war. Okay, wow. Well, we're here with a philosophical tug of war. So yes. So Caitlin, I wanted to hand it over to you next because last year Senator Gillibrand introduced the Fabric Act at the federal level. So can you tell us about what this policy is and how it would seek to address some of these issues that you've highlighted?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Fabric Act is the first federal, comprehensive federal fashion bill, which was very exciting. The bill itself was really born out of the fight that California garment workers had over SB 62, which was a bill that would address piece rate pay scale and joint and several liability at the state level for garment production, specifically driven and written by workers. Folks like the Garment Workers Center of Los Angeles were instrumental in Remake in getting this piece of legislation across the finish line. And kind of watching the work that they did during the pandemic to get this bill out there, a friend of mine kind of keyed me in and she was like, you need to pay attention to this. You do so much work in the labor space. Like, this is a great fight that needs to be happening across the country, not just in California. And so in doing some research, really looked at the bill that they had put together and thought like, oh, absolutely, this needs to have a federal nexus. There's definitely a way that we can bring this across the country. And working in the senator's office, I mean, we have New York City right there. We are, an iconic city for fashion across the globe. We should be leading by example here as well. So we put together the Fabric Act, and it built upon the legacy of SB 62, including the components around really setting a federal minimum wage floor for garment workers. You have to be paying the minimum wage. You can still utilize piece rate above and beyond that as an incentive structure. And for folks who don't know what piece rate is, that is when you pay by the unit. So a garment worker who's producing t-shirts, and maybe they're doing it on a sewing machine, maybe it's a cut and sew operation, they get paid by the number that they produce. That can lead to instances where people are paid way below what they should be. And it's ripe for exploitation because it's hard to keep track of. The fashion industry is opaque by design in an effort to make sure that the lowest costs are always the ones that they can utilize, and the place to cut cost is labor. So we eliminated piece rate below the minimum wage, and we used it as an incentive structure above and beyond there. So we know that there are good actors who use it, but we also know that there are bad actors who exploit it. We also kept their liability piece, which is liability up and down the supply chain. Those same bad actors on the manufacturing level usually contract with bad actors who are brands. And the only way that they're able to sell you a t-shirt for $5 is because someone is making it for 2 cents. So we wanted to make sure that garment workers were able to hold those brands accountable in the same way that they hold those manufacturers accountable for lost wages, for stolen wages. And that was really important to kind of keep that intact. And in having our conversations with brands, manufacturers, workers, civil society organizations across the country, we were also hearing that like the US is lacking in investment in this space. We love to pour money into manufacturing. We love to pour money into R&D and new development. But when we think about those things, we don't think about the fashion industry. And that's a mistake on our part. We should be investing in this sector, especially as we are coming out of a pandemic. 5 million women fell out of the workforce during the pandemic. This is a sector that is driven by women. And if there's a way to put them back to work in this space, it's something that we want to be able to invest in. So we created a federal grant program that goes along with this to incentivize brands expanding in the US, more manufacturers, smaller brands who can really tap into those resources. Some of the eligible uses for those tie into kind of what some of my colleagues have been talking about, the idea of more sustainable practices within your factory. If you're trying to buy equipment that takes a sheet of fabric and cuts it so that there's the least amount of waste yielded from it possible, that machinery is expensive. And if you're a new brand that's really trying to kind of tap into, oh, I have a responsibility from a climate perspective here, but I also want to invest in this new technology, but like the capital for that is hard. The federal government has an opportunity to step up and help you with that grant to expand your workforce and the work that you're doing. Also updating to make sure that your factories are safe for workers. This is historically an industry where women have not been safe at work, whether it's from a exploitation perspective or just from the machinery that they're working on is not safe. And then the last piece is training and workforce development. We wanted to make sure that as we see an aging population in this space, that those skills are being lost. We wanted to make sure that there was an opportunity for brands to be able to train new people and invest in expanding that and educating their own workforce. And then the last piece, which was one of the most important ones that we added on there, was a reshoring tax credit, because as I said in kind of my opening, so many of these jobs have left the United States and gone overseas. We have brands who are based in the United States, but who do most of their production in East Asia. They do most of their production in South America, and we want to bring them back. We want to bring them back to producing here in the U.S. In the same way that we want to make Made in America mean something, we also want to just expand that footprint exponentially. So we put a tax credit in there. And also, we know that this needs to be bipartisan, and Republicans love tax credits. So we figured this is a great way to get people on board. But that's really what the Fabric Act does. And we think it's kind of a holistic approach to reinvigorating the garment industry here in the US. We have over 150 endorsers. A lot of them are brands that you might be familiar with, folks like Everlane, Reformation, Mara Hoffman, but also huge swaths of organized labor, the AFL-CIO, Unite Here, Workers United, but also manufacturers. Farrar Manufacturing is a legacy manufacturer in the garment district. They've been there for decades. They are the ones who produce the Olympic uniforms and for Ralph Lauren. And they were one of the folks that we talked to early on about how can we replicate the work that you do in other places. And when we kind of walked them through the Fabric Act, they were eager to sign on, because basically our goal is to replicate the work that they do across the country.
Thanks for that. I'm not sure if it was mentioned earlier, but in California before SB 62, which, as Caitlin mentioned, is sort of part of the inspiration for it happening at the federal level, there were workers who were making less than $3 an hour. Yep. It was like $2 and I can't remember.
77 cents.
$2.77 in California in 2020. I don't know when the data was collected, but I mean, that was part of what fueled the campaign in California. And when it passed in California, it was groundbreaking to think that workers have to be paid now the minimum wage. That's it. It's the minimum wage.
Right. We're not asking a lot. We're asking that like people are actually paid fairly. No one can live on $2.77 an hour. No one can support their family on $2.77.
And not in California.
Exactly.
Especially not in California, where the minimum wage is like 15 or 20. I don't know what it is.
But not anywhere. Those are poverty wages for anybody, regardless of where you live in the United States. And to be clear, California and New York aren't the only places that have manufacturing here. North Carolina, Texas, Tennessee. There is a rich history of garment manufacturing across this country. And we want to make sure that as we're investing in expanding that industry, that those workers are paid fairly to do the work that they are incredibly skilled to do. There's some like clothing that we wear that like it can't be done on like a robotic large scale. Like a human has to do that. If you're wearing a crocheted top, a human has done that for you. And when you get dressed in the morning and you put that crocheted top on, that person got paid probably $3 to maybe make that, if it was made here in the US, let alone if it was made abroad. So like these are the kind of conscious thoughts that we should have as we're figuring out how we not only take the environmental aspect of our clothing into consideration, but like the immediate aspect of a person who produced that for you to be able to wear it.
Yeah. Yeah, so I guess maybe now passing over to Holly on more of this corporate perspective. How do you see corporations being a part of the solution to waste and some of these other issues in the industry?
Yeah, I think corporations are really an important part of this, because they need to be on board with legislation and things like that they will agree to kind of change this industry. But since I'm a zero waste campaign associate, I want to talk about the principles of like the circular economy. And if you don't know what that is, it's basically right now we have a linear economy where everything goes to the trash when we're done using it. But in a circular economy, it stays in the cycle. We reuse things, we reduce our consumption, and all good stuff like that. So there's something called an extended producer responsibility. So basically making companies be responsible for their products after the life cycle. So you see things where it's like Pepsi or Coca-Cola and their brands are on landfills like all over the world, but with the extended producer responsibility, they would be responsible for recycling or reusing those products. So putting legislation into effect that would do this in the textile industry for recycling textiles and things like that would be super important. Also reducing the amount of chemicals and things like that in clothes are also important, because we want to reduce the amount of things that are going to the landfills and being burned, we need to make sure textiles are able to be recycled. And with all the chemicals that are in clothes, we aren't able to do that right now. And with overstock, legislating that companies can't burn all their excess clothes is also super important, not just for the environmental aspect, but also for the health aspect of people who live in those communities where clothes are being burned, because the pollution gets into those communities and really affects people. And there's examples of companies doing things like this, like recently with Patagonia. Sure, they're not a perfect company in different aspects, but they have programs where you can send your clothes back and they'll mend them for you and send them back because they want you to be able to use them your whole life. They don't want them to be thrown away once every time you buy them. So
Yeah, I remember they had that ad that was like, "Don't buy this jacket." It was a
Yeah.
few years ago, but it was about that. It was
Yeah.
about waste and excess consumption. So
And they also use a bunch of recycled content in their clothes, which is also something that would be cool for laws to be passed. Like, you need a certain percent recycled content in your clothes.
well, that ties really nicely into the question that we have for Tara, which is how is the DC government thinking about fashion waste and incorporating programs to improve recycling or disposal of these products?
So DC government right now, especially through the DC Department of Energy and Environment, is doing all kinds of things around donation reuse. That's the program that I work in. And I just started in May. Everything has been, kind of kicking off. I will say I did ask them how my job came to be because I was curious to know like where the money came from and whatever. And they told a story that went all the way back to 2012 and how one of the council members, Mary Che, was the one who kind of started to seed this, and it took until 2022 to finally get someone in the role. So I think that's kind of a way of thinking about government, and in terms of like the tools in the toolbox, it is a tool that is dull enough that it requires a long period of time to really see its fruits, let's say. And it's something that I think about in my role because I'm thinking, 10 years from now, who's the person who's going to be maybe doing what I'm doing and what kind of foundation am I laying for them? And I think if all of us are doing that, that's another way that how everyday consumers can advocate for change. We might not see it in our lifetimes or immediately, but someone a decade later is going to have their dream job basically because of that whatever seed you plant right now. So basically, to go through the list of things that I want you all to know about, donation reuse program is going to be putting out an RFA, a request for applications for grants, starting in October. So if you have any ideas that you would like incubated along the lines of seeing what is possible in the circular economy while we're in this current take, make, waste economy, then please keep an eye out for that grant. And if you want to receive notifications, I would go to the Sustainable DC website, and there's like a newsletter, and you can put in your email and you can be notified of those grants. Another thing we're doing is we just last week launched a website. It's a map-based directory where anyone in DC can type in their address, what they want to either donate, shop, or repair, and then it has a directory and a dynamic directory of all of those things. So we just launched that, reuse.dc.gov. Please go and check it out. Technology is only as useful as the people who are actually using it. So the more people who use it and inform its user design and user interface, then the better and more useful this platform will be. And then other things that we're doing is, who here has something in their house that they're like, oh, I really want to fix this thing? Does anyone have something like that? Okay, well, all of you who raised your hands, on October 12th at MLK Library, there's a Fix-It event in the labs in the basement of MLK Library. I don't know if you've all been there, but there's a 3D printer there. There's all kinds of stuff going on down there, and we have coaches from different areas, textile, bikes, etc. And you can come and bring what you want fixed, and you can have it fixed there. I fixed a record player. The coach who does mending is actually amazing, and it's like such a joy just to watch her like work her magic on whatever you bring. And if you are not able to get there, you need an accommodation request, there's a number that you can call to even So let's try to like get people there and have this socialization of the circular economy really incorporated into our rituals, into the way that we like hang out with one another, maybe. So that's Fix It events, and then there's also a program called Rethread DC, and that one is kind of in development. So if anyone has any ideas or they're interested in participating in that, please come and see me. And finally, we do sponsor some swap events. So we just sponsored a swap DC event at the DC State Fair, which was a big success. There were 100 people who visited, and 78 of them donated to the swap. And we recycled over 100 pounds of textile from that and upcycled and customized, wardrobes for 10 people. So those are some of the things we're doing. But again, there's so much more to be done. And I think if you have ideas, go to the zero waste, framework draft thing and submit your ideas, and let's get involved in how we do this.
Yeah, everybody. I think you'll be around afterwards and we can make sure that people can get in contact with you if they want more information. It's funny, when we were putting together this panel, it took us forever to decide on what we would actually cover because there's so many issues. And then in the end, we were like, well, just bring everybody. So I hope you're, getting a little bit of a sampler of, the so many different angles and the entry points for everybody in this space. We're going to go into our last round of questions for our speakers. And if we have time, which I'm not sure we will, we'll open it up for Q&A. And if not, then you're very much welcome to find the speakers afterwards. But I want to bring it back up to the global level and Convention 190, which what Robin was talking about. And could you, share with some people in the room about how individuals can support the adoption of Convention 190, because it has to be adopted by individual countries to go into effect into those countries, and what can individuals do to support women working in the garment sector?
Sure, and I'm going to try to be brief because we do want to hear questions. Since it was adopted by the UN in 2019, we've had 20 countries already ratify, and I've heard a rumor that Canada is going to do this early next year. And I think ratification, as you said, is a really important step. And there are garment workers in countries all over the world who are leading the campaigns in their countries to get them to ratify. And I'm happy to connect you with the organizations supporting those efforts. I can't say enough how important it is to work directly with the people who've been working, who are impacted, who are directing this work, who were responsible for the adoption of this new standard, and ask them, how do we help you? But I think something that I remember hearing a lot is they feel so disconnected. We've talked about the global supply chain a little bit, but I can't express to you how many steps there are from one point to another. I think Holly did the best job of explaining that. And so they feel very disconnected. They don't actually think any of us know that they're being raped on a daily basis so that you can have a t-shirt. And we need to say it like that because it's real. Like I'm not doing this for shock value. I spent quality time with hundreds and hundreds of women, and the more time I spent with them, the more they felt comfortable disclosing. And it's unbelievable, right, what they experience on a regular basis. And I think they recognize that as consumers, you are in a powerful position to drive decision-making, right, by the manufacturers and the brands that buy from those manufacturers. And I want to say something that's really important. I actually met a lot of manufacturers, and I've talked to a lot of brands who are well-intentioned in this space, right? It's just like in the States, like everyone's like, gender-based violence in the world of work sucks, like let's get rid of it. And I'm thrilled with that. But the commitment that it's going to take to change the culture in our societies to no longer tolerate this as acceptable behavior is a big lift. Now we have the tools and we have the knowledge, and it starts by asking the women, how can we help you, right? Let's not deny it's happening. Let's not deny it's a problem, right? Like, let's kind of move beyond that. So I'm happy to connect you. Then domestically, I want to say something. The United States doesn't generally ratify conventions. I'm not getting into the politics of that. It doesn't actually really matter, because what is happening domestically is that cities and states are looking at integrating the language from the convention in their laws. So for example, the definition of sexual harassment in the United States in our laws is extraordinarily narrow. We learned this with Me Too. Right? Like all these women and men are coming forward, disclosing the experiences that they're having with what I view as gender-based violence in the world of work. And then you look at your state or your federal law definition, the feds is the worst, under Title VII. And they're like, well, it doesn't fit within that narrow definition. That's correct. That was written in the 1960s by white men. Okay, so like we got a gap problem, right? Now we have a definition from this global tool that was written by women right? And men who experience these things. It's much broader, right? It's gender. It's not a women's issue, right? That's expansive in and of itself. So I am engaged in a lot of those efforts on the state and federal level, happy to connect you, right, with the people who are doing that. And I'm really proud that the Biden administration has incorporated references to this convention into global strategies that they've issued on equity and equality. I know that the leadership from this administration really believes in, and they voted in support of it, right? So whether or not it gets ratified for us here in the States, I wouldn't fixate so much. But I'm happy, I actually made slides and forgot them, but I'm happy to provide information, right, that's really accessible about why it's important to adopt some key provisions in this so that we do see all workers in the United States, including garment workers, protected from these abuses. And there's just a great network of folks to tie in here with. So like I said, ways to support folks in other countries, right? Way to support folks here to really bring the language of the convention alive and meaningful in its implementation.
Thanks for that. And one of the things you just briefly mentioned that we did not have time to get into is the complexity of global supply chains and the lack of accountability, the lack of any repercussions really for brands, for companies, for suppliers, all of that. But one of the things that SB 662 in California and the Fabric Act are doing they are establishing joint and several liability, which again, I don't think we have time to really get into it, but it's incredibly progressive for the time. I mean, it's amazing that it got passed in California, and it would be really cool to see it on the federal level. So Caitlin, I mean, how can people support the Fabric?
And if I could just clarify what that means is right now what happens is if gender-based violence and harassment happens in a particular factory, the factory is held accountable, but then they say, well, I have these conditions because I have to meet the quotas that the brand is requiring of me, right? But the brand says, well, but they're your employees. So if you're doing bad stuff there, it's not our problem, right? And legally speaking, globally, it's been very hard to hold people accountable all the way up to the top. And so and this is the stick, right? I want to be clear. I'm a big fan of carrots, but the stick, right, is to hold everybody accountable throughout the supply chain for the exploitation of the workers who are making it possible to develop those clothes, right? I have to say, increasingly at the same time, and we support this as well, there are brands and manufacturers who are like, I'm serious about this. Let's work together, right? And some work that I was involved in Lesotho was a groundbreaking agreement between some of the global brands that Levi's, right? And garment manufacturers coming together and saying collectively, like, we are committed, right? And we're going to work with the unions in our factories. So, there's just I want to be very clear that this is not a simple like good guy, bad guy situation. Does that make sense? It's complex though. So sorry, I just wanted to, the lawyer in me is like joint and several liability. It's like, okay, no normal person has any idea what that means. Like, okay.
Oh, thank you for that. That's great. So Caitlin, how can people support the Fabric Act?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one of the things, and we were talking about this earlier, is that the Fabric Act being the first kind of like comprehensive federal fashion bill, we've got a handful of co-sponsors. We're very excited to have them on board. We need more. We need so many more. And one of the biggest challenges that we have currently is that, like, in the same way that like you are a captive audience to this topic, members of Congress don't have a whole lot of ideas about this issue, and they need a lot of education in this space. They need a lot of education beyond the idea of like, why would I support a bill that's about fashion? And fundamentally, like, that's a thing that we have to push through and then educate them on the economic impact, the trade implications, the actual kind of like workforce development side of things. And so like the Fabric Act, we are excited that it's the first federal fashion bill, but the way that we have this conversation is that it is an economic impact bill fundamentally. And so as we have those conversations with members of Congress, what we really need is more folks like yourselves. I'm seeing like a lot of students in the room, is that the states that you come from, I guarantee your senator hasn't co-sponsored yet. So please feel free to call them and tell them that they should co-sponsor the Fabric Act, that it will be good for them, their states, for the economy that they have there, and your members of your House of Representative members as well. We need as many folks as possible to kind of get on board so we can push this bill forward and gain more traction. We're also obviously, if you have relationships with organizations that work in this space, if you have particular brands that you love and you want to see them as endorsers of the Fabric Act, that's a great opportunity to reach out to them as well. We need all the help we can get. This bill is going to need a lot of education and a lot of enthusiasm behind it. So happy to chat with folks afterwards about how that works and how you can get engaged. Our friends at Remake have also done a lot of the external work on rallying folks. They've organized call-in days to offices. They had really successful push in Illinois that brought Senator Duckworth on as a co-sponsor with us, which we were really excited about. And organizing like that around the bill is what's going to help us move it forward. So we're really excited, and we encourage you all to help participate with us.
Yeah, in DC, it can be hard sometimes when you feel like you don't have somebody to represent you up at the level, but surely everybody has friends or family who live in other states. I'm looking at my sisters who are here visiting this weekend from other states. So yeah, well, we can have a conversation later. But anyways, now over to Holly. Could you just tell us some of the work that you've done around, working with corporations regarding waste and waste management and how that can be, brought to a more tangible level for individuals?
Yeah, so PIRG does a couple of campaigns with their Beyond Plastic, and one of them is these fashion campaigns. So the one we did is Waste is Out of Fashion, and basically we asked people to send letters to governors to pass legislation and write legislation on reducing the amount of overstock that companies have, and basically banning that and getting rid of that because it's such a wasteful part of the fashion industry. So that's something we did, but in the broader sense of what we're trying to do is start these conversations because there's not too much legislation around the fashion industry, especially on the sustainability side. So we're trying to build up that conversation. We also did a report on PFAS, the chemical that I've been talking a little bit about, and it's how much it is in the different clothes of different companies. So we basically did a scorecard and scored the different companies on their transparency and how much they have and their commitments and if they've met previous commitments and stuff like that. So that's what we're trying to just build conversation around this topic.
Thank you. And then our last question before I'm looking for you. I don't know how much time we have left for Q&A. Okay. All right. So we'll have Tara and then we'll open up for just a couple of questions. So Tara, can you tell us a little bit about the reuse and reduce and reuse group that DOE has created and how the group connects DC residents with the DC's zero waste plan?
So I think I kind of covered that in the previous one, and I'll just be quick. There are two specific things that it would be awesome if you all could actively contribute to the website. One is that you can go to your favorite donation, reuse, or repair spaces, businesses, organizations, nonprofits, whatever, and make sure that they're on the directory because every day there's a new one. And we have so many that are kind of, hidden gems, and we want to make sure we uplift them. Speaking of which, I want to uplift my favorite space, some of my favorite spaces. This dress is from Secondi in DuPont Circle. This hat is from Mercedes-Benz, which is the longest running vintage shop in DC in Adams Morgan. Secondi, I think, is the second longest running. And then this incredible, look at this. Can you imagine, speaking of the people who made this, from Meeps in Adams Morgan, which is also the only woman-owned all-year-round costume shop in the region or in the DMV area, I believe. So please go and uplift your favorite spaces. Make sure that they're on the directory. And if they're not, then you can let them know about it and have them added to the directory. The second thing is there's an events part of that website. If you all are going to any events, which it's DC, there's every day, there's going to be millions of events going on. Please, anything that has to do with reuse, donation, this conversation, go and uplift those events as well, because those are the safe spaces where we can, kind of get the ball rolling on action and take conversation into practice. So yeah, that's pretty much the only thing. And then see you on October 12th for the Fix It event at MLK.
Great, thank you. With that, we will go ahead and open it up for just a few questions from the audience. Okay, great. That went quick. I don't know who was first, but how about you right there? And yes.
Okay. Hey, my name is Andrea. The question I have, so I don't work in fashion, but I do work in workforce development. So it's clear about the Fabric Act. So, but as someone who wears clothing, where can I find information about companies that are thinking about workers in the U.S. and internationally, and thinking about waste, reducing that waste so that I'm like not buying clothes that aren't made like in a way that thinks about workers and that's not sustainable.
I can provide one comment, and then if anybody wants to answer specifically here. So the question itself was, where do you go to find resources about the brands out there, and how do you know what brands are doing, whether it's good or bad? And one resource I can share is that Remake has a guide on their website. It's really good. They update it annually. It scores. It's actually a pretty complex scoring system to try to capture the many elements. So I think there was a Remake QR code around here, but there's also a Remake table back there. It's right by the staircase. So if you want to get more information about that specific guide, please stop over there or go online. Does anybody else have another comment on that?
All I would say is the reason I like the Remake resources is because it's rigorous. So this is just a dangerous space. Sorry, just going to flag that. And that is that people, are well-intentioned, right? And so they put statements on their websites about how they're committed, right? And I believe that they are. And give a little space here. But what does that really mean, right? Like what's really happening? And so I would just caution you because I've seen other tools out there and it's very nice to sign on to something that says, yes, we care about our workers, right? But like, there's no accountability in that. So I would just caution. The other thing is I hear this from manufacturers a lot. I hear this from workers actually a lot. And I hear this from brands a lot. We are still in a space where they feel like they're putting their neck out. If they spend some of their money and their effort to really integrate efforts to address the things we're talking about in the supply chain for garment in particular, we need to not only support them by buying clothes from them, but we need to shout it from the rooftops and we need to communicate back to them. Their stakeholders, their stockholders need to hear from us. Like, does that make sense? Like really, like I realize I'm a silent purchaser and I need to be better about going to the website and actually proactively sending a message that says, here's why I bought your clothes, right? Because when we buy them, they don't know why, right? So they need to hear from us and their stockholders need to hear from us because we need to see a direct connection between addressing, for example, gender-based violence and harassment, right? And your stock price. These are mostly publicly held companies, and they want to hear. We're in a very interesting moment in time about activism, right, in that space. So just another plug for the Remake website, but also just it's a crowded space. I know of a lot of other places that claim to be measuring these things. Just, do a little due diligence.
Yes, be cautious when you're like hunting through websites that like love to like. We didn't even get to this topic, but like the conversation around like it's made from recycled materials. Well, like there's no definition as to what recycled materials actually is, or it's made with like it's sustainably made, which is like my least favorite thing to see on a website because like that doesn't actually mean anything if you don't define those things. So like it's really tough to like do your own personal due diligence, which is like why the work that Remake does is so incredibly important because they do this like very rigorous vetting because it's tough. It's tough when you're trying to like in this age of kind of conscious consumerism, like you're trying. And it's so hard to do this in addition to like every other thing you need to do in your life to try to like make it as impactful as possible. And like the responsibility we feel, all of that is great, but like when brands make it really, really hard to understand if they actually are doing the right thing, it just can feel overwhelming. So hopefully they help to take the guesswork out of it, which I think is very important.
And I'll just add one additional comment to that, saying what Robin said about brands hearing you and hearing your voice. There's several examples of this where significant positive contributions have been made, but just within the pandemic itself, at the beginning of the pandemic, $40 billion worth of orders were canceled for work that had already been done. Women had sewed the clothes 2 months before. So women living in the global south and brands canceled all the orders and $40 billion was disappearing from the global south. And through the work of advocacy, in the end, about $20 billion of that money was actually later recommitted to those workers. So that it was a direct result of consumers, a huge consumer campaign, the Pay Up campaign, if you ever heard of it, to get brands to actually pay up for the orders that they placed, that were produced, that workers had already done the labor for, and then were never paid for. So consumer and civil society action is actually really important to driving brands to make those decisions about how they restructure and can support causes. So I'm going to go, yes, to the back right there. Yes, you.
Laurel, I just wanted to share. Can I
I'm
add
so
something?
sorry. Please
no,
go
that's
ahead.
fine. And then it looked like I don't know if there were members of the audience that had ideas as well, but Gabby of Fashion Connection actually just shared this with me, the good map of DC. Here's the QR code. I guess it's localized to that question. Another place that I would look is one of the longest entities that I've seen in this space is Fashion Takes Action, and they put together this conference called the World Ethical Apparel Roundtable WEAR Conference. And that one is really great because it's actually a space where like companies will send people. And I think when you see the company's actions, their ritual, then it's a great indicator of, you know, what they're trying to do. Not necessarily what they're accomplishing, but at least what they're trying to do. And I think that's a great sign too.
Thank you. I think this is going to be the last question. I'm very sorry. We have so many great, I'm sure, questions in the crowd. But yes, please go ahead.
Sorry, I couldn't see you guys, so I had to wait. Firstly, I think what you do is amazing. So as you guys were speaking, I started to think about like low income areas, like middle class, that are like the predominantly buyers of fast fashion. So I think what my question is, you know, what you guys are doing is great, and in turn, what I'm thinking is that the cost of fashion is going to go up as a result of the work. So how are these people in low income areas gonna get like fashion that, you know, probably isn't thrifted or like is new clothes, but they'll be able to contribute to that because they won't be able to like think consciously about what they're buying or go to specific areas because people who are, you know, like middle class, high income, they get to, you know, think more consciously about stuff and not people in those areas. Thank you.
Yes. So the question was thinking about, you know, if the price of fashion goes up, how does that impact people who might have more economic difficulties in purchasing fashion? And you know, fast fashion, you know, some people have argued it's an equalizer in some ways in terms of allowing people to express themselves in a certain way. So just thinking more about what would be the impact if the price of fashion went up? How would that impact low income populations?
This is being recorded, right? So I never lose sight of how much money corporations made during COVID. They generally make like gobs of money, but like, wow, during a time of real difficulty and trauma for the world, it was really particularly difficult to see. I would say brands in the garment space, probably not so much because they were hit by some of the things, but you know, there's this fallacy out there about costs and profits, right? I'm old enough to remember when workers were held, and unions still hold this, that the CEO of a company couldn't make more than 10 times or 15 times the lowest paid person. I miss those days desperately. We have gotten far away from that. There is a way for a lot of the brands that we're talking about to, because this is an excuse that we often hear, is it's going to raise the cost of the thing if we do that and nobody's going to buy our stuff. Well, you might not make $4 billion this year. You'll make like 3.8. You know, like for me, I can't get my brain separated from that when we talk about this. Because what you're describing is a very real problem, right? Because it does, but they don't have to raise the price of the products at the level that they're claiming. And there's been calculators done on this at the level that they're claiming that they have to ensure that you don't get raped at your job to make the t-shirt. I refuse to accept that as a premise. It pisses me off, actually. Sorry, it's not you, it's the deal. So the other thing is, I believe that if we maintain the global pressure that we're talking about and it becomes cool, hip, and in, and the best thing ever to ensure that the clothes that are being made sustainable for all the reasons we're talking about. It's not sustainable if we're making these clothes off the backs of low-income women who are being abused every day. It's not sustainable if we're putting these toxins into our community. And it's not sustainable if we keep pushing that. Like, I have clothes that I bought when I was 20. Okay, there's a lot we can unpack there. But the point is, like, it's just how I was raised. I didn't have a lot of money.
Yes.
I had 3 t-shirts. They were also better made, I would argue. You know, but I think there's a culture, and it started to shift during COVID. So part of it is that too, right? Is let's make it hip and cool to go to Sakandi, which is like one of my all-time favorites, right? rather than to get a new, there's a lot of social pressure. I experienced the social pressure as a young person, right? Where I was wearing like my 3 sweaters, like all semester, right? And it sucked, but we have to move to a space, right? Where it's acceptable not to do that. And we need to keep applying pressure to these brands most effectively, like the ones that we do consume a lot of, so that everybody benefits. That's the idea. Does that make any sense? Like if we apply the appropriate pressure, then that price doesn't go up that much. They make better clothes. By the way, the speed with which we're requiring people to spit out the number of things that they're being required to do, right, affects the quality. And it also
speed to keep up with social media.
They all have to quit these jobs when they're like 40. Imagine what it is like. I mean, that's a high number, right? These are not lifetime jobs. You can't stay in these jobs because it's debilitating because of the things that we're talking about. So there's a lot of incentives in the system to change it, but I refuse to accept the premise that in order to make our clothing safely and sustainably, that it's going to cost too much, so we can't do it. I don't believe it.
There's also, I think, one of the key pieces that's a part of this, and like we talk about fast fashion and like the overconsumption that goes along with fast fashion. Folks that live in low-income families and below the poverty line are some of the folks who know how to make things last more than anything. They know how to be thrifty with their dollars. They know how to make things stretch. They're not the ones who are contributing to like the overconsumption of fast fashion. It's like the $700 Shein haul TikToker that is the one that's like making this challenging. Like it's the overconsumption of, I want to be able to buy 15 bathing suits and they each cost me $10. Like that's where we're going to hit a wall on the fast fashion side of things, and everything's making its way to a landfill. Everything's making its way to a landfill, not here, but not necessarily, but abroad. And that's a whole other conversation. But yeah, the premise that like, that corporations can continue to rake it in and their always go to is like, oh, well, if we want to make it well, or we want to make, like, if we're going to have to pay the federal minimum wage to make it, my costs are going to skyrocket. Remake actually just had data that they put out a few days ago that like when you actually pay the minimum wage, it made like cost of labor go up like less than 3%. Not cost of goods entirely, cost of just labor. Like this can be done, and it can be done well, and it doesn't need to be done on the backs of the low-income people who are the people who are actually producing these clothes, and it doesn't need to be done at the expense of those folks who then want to turn around and be able to have access to quality clothing for the rest of their like buying life. That's not fair in either direction. And corporations are the ones that overwhelmingly benefit in this like kind of bizarre dichotomy that we've set up. That's also just capitalism amok, but that's another conversation.
Oh yeah, I just want to add one thing. You mentioned thrifting. And I think as we move to like a more circular economy, that's going to be really big. But I wanted to mention that I'm sure you guys have heard of ThredUp, but I feel like they have options where you can click new, because there are a lot of clothes that like people never wear, but they still cycle through. So like there's increasingly those options of like you can still like get new clothes that have never been worn, but they're like thrifted. So I think that's going to be a big thing, especially with making sure they stay in the cycle.
Thank you so much for your question. What was your name? Because you didn't introduce yourself. Michelle. That is such a key question. And I think the theme from this conversation is that those who do things out of necessity are going to be the most efficient resources of solutions. And centering our solutions around impacted communities it might take a little more time, a little more conflict transformation, a little more work, but it's worth it because you're going to get more sustainable solutions and things that everyone can take. When you lift from the bottom, everyone can take something from that. So one thing that has given me a little bit of hope, I'll say, in Chocolate City is that the DOE actually is leading in this thing called the Racial Equity Impact Assessment, which is a whole new framework for how you assess the impact of the policies that are being implemented. And so this is something that I think, exactly like what we've been saying, this is the time. Now is the time for all of us to really be assessing. We can assess our own actions. We can assess our representatives' actions. We can assess our businesses' actions. And we have all these tools to be able to do that. And the more that we center impacted communities, then the more resilient our solutions will be. So people who are the ones who stretch the dollar, they are the ones who have the best, honestly, they have the best solutions about how we just live the circular economy. It's not something you have to choose because you have all this extra time and you're like, oh, I wish I could, be a little more green in my choices. It's like, no, they have to do that. So I'm so glad that you asked that question. And I'll just say that like the donation reuse program is inside the sustainability and equity branch of DOEE. And so many things are now being framed through a lens of equity and environmental justice. And when you look at who is actually receiving the impact of this kind of waste economy, it's going to be people who live near incinerators. It's going to be people who live in places where their representatives don't have enough political capital to be able to make sure that their water is kept to a certain standard. And who are those people? Those are the people who are likely going to be buying from these, cheaper places to buy these clothes. So it's so important that we apply an equity framework to every one of the policies that we're advocating for.
Thank you. And I think this is all we have time for today, but hopefully you picked up on some of the gems in the conversation. Before we get going, I just wanted to remind everybody that there are tables downstairs with some vendors who came in from our community that have many resources that they would like to share with you about how you can get engaged in sustainable fashion. There's also a quiz, or trivia. Quiz is scary, trivia is fun. There's trivia about the panel and about some of the things we talked about today. And the winner of trivia, there are 2 prizes, I heard. So if you want to find out more about the trivia, you can go to the Remake table. And then, yeah, I think that's it. So please join me in thanking our amazing panelists today, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you all so much, and especially thank you to our fantastic moderator, Laurel Anderson Hafner. The fair will continue until 4 o'clock, and at 4 o'clock, you're invited to take a tour of our current exhibition, Korean Fashion from Royal Court to Runway. So enjoy, ask questions, network together, and we'll see you around the museum.